Hi, and welcome back to Signstuck, the postmodern primer based on Andrew Hussie's webcomic, Homestuck. Today, we're going to be talking about Jean François Lyotard and what he meant by metanarrative. These days, the meta prefix is often thrown around to mean anything self-referential or recursive, but Lyotard meant something both more expansive and more specific. In fact, in the original French, he used the phrase grand narrative, which could be translated more literally as just big story. So, what makes Lyotard's big stories big? Grand narratives are about big things, about how the world works, or what the future of humanity or a particular society is going to be. Now, myths can definitely be grand narratives. According to Lyotard, storytelling, or narrative knowledge, is the oldest form of knowledge humans have, but not all myths are metanarratives. Metanarratives don't just explain something in a given culture's terms. A metanarrative explains everything, or at least tries to. Everything relates to one master idea. The myth of progress, that civilization will continue to become wiser and more prosperous due to steady technological advancement, is one metanarrative. Everything that happens is connected in this story, past, present, and future. The dualist idea that everything is a great battle between the forces of good and evil is another metanarrative. Metanarratives can also describe how individual lives supposedly work. The story of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps is a metanarrative that says individual determination, hard work, and independence will lead to success. But it also implies things about how the whole world works. If determination and hard work are always rewarded, that means that those are the most important virtues, and that the world is fundamentally fair. Metanarratives are a key part of legitimation. Legitimation basically means any process by which a culture or a community agrees on what is known. Crucially, knowledge for Lyotard is broader than facts. Knowledge involves not just knowing what is true, but what is just, what is wise, how to behave, and so on. This is a problem. How can a society possibly agree on what is just, if not by relying on facts to prove it? By trusting the big stories. The metanarrative underlying democracy is that people want to live in a just society, and through voting, it is the common people that determine the laws. So, of course they would be just. If you believe that story is true about your country, then you recognize the state as legitimate. Quick spoiler alert. One of the defining features of postmodernism, according to Lyotard, is what he called an incredulity towards metanarratives. Basically, we don't believe them anymore. In many cases, we no longer believe that it's possible for one idea to explain everything. In Homestuck, several characters embrace a metanarrative that overlaps with narrative in the sense of the story itself. Rose, Vriska, and Calliope in particular are very concerned with their role in the story, but instead of following the familiar archetypal beats that the earlier acts set up, Act 6 shows that none of them are constrained or elevated by the kind of story they think they belong to. Vriska thinks her life will have worth and meaning if she can manage to be the villain and the hero. She sees that John is important and so inserts herself into his history so that she too is important. She wants to create Bec Noir and then defeat him. Later, she wants to have the big showdown with Lord English, even at the cost of her personal growth and happiness. When Rose Sprite appears, Rose has a breakdown because it flies in the face of her ability to understand herself in terms of a proper coming-of-age or quest story. This development makes absolutely no sense. Not for us as a group, and definitely not for me personally, or her for that matter. How could this possibly mean anything for my growth or personal development in any way? This almost makes it official. I have no comprehensible path. There's nothing to overcome, no lesson to learn, no cathartic light at the end of this preposterous tunnel. Not for me, at least. I seriously have the dumbest arc anyone could conceivably imagine. Rose, we don't have fucking arcs. We are just human beings. Rose wants to have an arc. She wants the big story of having an adventure and growing up to give meaning, purpose, and validation to everything she's been through so far. But her development in Homestuck isn't a typical journey, or even one with clear closure. In the Game Over timeline, Rose struggles with her alcoholism, mother issues, and passive-aggressive defense mechanisms, and eventually overcomes them, declaring her love for Kanaya and Roxy with her literal dying breath. But when the timeline gets rewritten, none of that happens, and a lot of fans were originally kind of upset about that, just like Rose herself is, from a certain perspective. But the message of Homestuck sides more with Dave. If we really imagine Rose as a fully realized person, then she doesn't have to have a character arc on a timetable. She doesn't have to confront all her problems and die nobly and dramatically. She can keep growing up after her grand adventure is over, after she's 16, after the final curtain. When Calliope meets Alt Calliope, they have this exchange. I thought this encounter might hold some purpose for me, that you might let me know how I fit into everything from this moment onward. Your only relevance here, and to the greater good, was to function as my signal. A simple notification, as foretold by Echidna. Now that you are here, I can go. But then, what should I do? You don't need to do anything. Be who you've become, and who I didn't. Consume the fruits of an existence I could never understand. Live. Life, Homestuck says, does not conform to the big stories we tell ourselves about it. No destiny waits to be revealed, and no overarching theme connects every moment or decision. Lyotard's critics have pointed out that metanarratives still have plenty of cultural and intellectual power, but there's certainly both less faith in metanarratives and less agreement about which one, if any, might apply to and explain our current circumstances. The very idea that one explanation or principle should hold true for everyone is derided as close-minded or even tyrannical. Maybe your worldview works great for you, but not for me. Lyotard argues that even science is ultimately dependent on narrative rather than experiment to legitimate itself. Any individual experiment could be poorly designed, incorrectly executed, incorrectly interpreted, or have results caused by chance instead of according to the experimenter's hypothesis. Scientists believe in a metanarrative about the experimental method. If they only accept results that would happen by chance 5% of the time, and share their research so that other scientists can repeat the experiments, over time the scientific consensus will converge on the truth. The results are legitimated by the community according to this shared narrative. Scientists don't actually have pure knowledge of reality. They have the statistical results of experiments. According to the scientific metanarrative, that's the same thing as being fact, even if a more nuanced scientific view might say that statistical results can validly be treated as facts until new evidence arises. The metanarrative about science in broader culture often has a more black and white view. How many times have you seen a headline that was some variation of the phrase, "New study proves X"? The scientific process is equated with a pure or absolute truth, even when that process is highly fallible, inexact, and incomplete. This particularly worries Lyotard because of the way that it interacts with wealth and power. The ability to replicate most experiments depends on being able to afford cutting-edge instruments and other technology. Therefore, the shape of scientific knowledge is influenced by the interests of people who buy the equipment. That's why terrible diseases that affect only a few people, or mostly poor people, are often less well-researched than things like weight loss and baldness, which allow pharmaceutical companies to turn big profits. He calls this legitimation by power, or legitimation by performativity. That is, science is justified, to itself or to the public more broadly, because it is productive in a measurable, quantifiable, economic way. This is the short-sighted mindset that argues that any study that isn't obviously contributing to economic growth is a waste of time, effort, and grant money. Now, Lyotard definitely doesn't want science to be legitimated by or dependent on power, but he worries firstly that it is, and secondly that this phenomenon is an inherent part of the metanarrative that scientific practice is based on. His view of the scientific method also has its critics, but what matters for us is that even seemingly objective things like science can't be relied on absolutely or perfectly proven without recourse to a metanarrative for legitimation. We don't believe them because they can guarantee themselves to be true. We believe them because they fit into a big story that we all agree to accept. And without that agreement, legitimation can't work on a community-wide level. Without legitimation, there's no clear path to trusting information, institutions, or each other. How do people decide what is true in the era of #fake news, where everyone disagrees about which of many imperfect news sources are trustworthy? Maybe some people have the time to evaluate all the available evidence, investigate sources, and make their own decisions. But a lot of us just rely on our biases, and others have given up trying to figure it out altogether. And that inability to agree on a baseline makes it harder for society to function. As a first guardian, Doc Scratch is almost completely omniscient, and of course, he never lies. But that doesn't mean he can be trusted. He asks leading questions, avoids questions he doesn't wish to answer, and reveals very selective details to deliberately imply untrue things. He manipulates Vriska into killing Aradia, leads Rose to go grimdark, and completely misleads her about the outcome of her mission to deploy the tumor and destroy the Green Sun. And even if he were not malicious, it would still be impossible to get the whole truth from him. As he tells Rose, it's impossible for him to ever tell her the entire truth, because infinite facts would take infinite time to relate, or at the very least, a finite number of facts about a given universe would take a commensurately large universe-long time to relate, which they also do not have. You can never know all of the facts. Only I can. And since it's impossible for me to reveal all facts to you, it is my discretion alone that decides which facts will be revealed in the finite time we have. If I do not volunteer information you deem critical to your fate, it possibly means that I am a scoundrel, but it does not mean that I am a liar. And it certainly means you did not ask the right questions. One of Lyotard's most prescient observations about the postmodern period was that a shift was taking place in how people interact with knowledge. Instead of being rare or restricted, depending on where you live, knowledge is now exponentially more abundant and more accessible than in any other period in history. However, there is so much information available that no one can digest all of it in a reasonable time frame. As early as the 80s, Lyotard predicted that as digitization and access to facts increased, power would consist of the ability to sort through masses of information, find the relevant information, and repackage and distribute it in a useful or actionable format. In the postmodern world, success depends on being able to skillfully navigate the abundance of information, the ability to ask the right questions. And in the absence of cultural consensus around a metanarrative, legitimation by power means that it is precisely those already in power who most get to choose which questions get asked. Even worse, we might be deluding ourselves about what kinds of answers are even possible. As Doc Scratch says, lies of omission do not exist. The concept is a very human one. It is the product of your story writing again. You have written a story about the truth, making emotional demands of it, and in particular of those in possession of it. One of the emotional demands we tend to make of the truth is that it be the truth, that it be singular, specific, and reliable. But what if there is no such stable truth? From quantum physics to fractals to chaos theory, Lyotard saw many fields of science and mathematics moving away from the concept of truth, with major consequences for how we think about knowing and knowledge in the first place. Postmodern science, by concerning itself with such things as undecidables, the limits of precise control, conflicts characterized by incomplete information, fracta, catastrophes, and pragmatic paradoxes, is theorizing its own evolution as discontinuous, catastrophic, non-rectifiable, and paradoxical. It is changing the meaning of the word knowledge, while expressing how such a change can take place. It is producing not the known, but the unknown, and it suggests a model of legitimation that has nothing to do with maximized performance, but has as its basis difference, understood as paralogy. In the field of logic, paralogy is a kind of false reasoning, which contradicts logical rules or formulas. For Lyotard, this didn't mean deliberately bad reasoning. Instead, it means trying to use reasoning, or other knowledge-seeking activities, without assuming or proving that there must be an absolutely stable object under exploration at all. In Homestuck, things which appear to be stable and absolute often turn out to be contradictory, unstable, or paradoxical. The entire setting is referred to as paradox space. The alpha timeline is the most obvious example. All of the build-up throughout the first 5 acts is about the inevitability of the alpha timeline. Even before we know its name, the countdown timers on the player's crux treaders reveal that Earth itself is doomed, and as they soon discover, not even winning the game will allow them to recover the world they are losing. And yet, both Dave and Jade's meteors are diverted to buy them extra time to enter the medium. Rose slices Dave's meteor in half, delaying direct impact, and Becquerel becomes Becksprite in order to change the course of Jade's meteor, defying the supposedly inexorable countdowns. As the beta session progresses, the trolls emphasize that nothing the kids do can prevent the alpha timeline from transpiring the way it does. From the creation of Bec Noir to the cancerous nature of their very universe, the alpha timeline is simply the way it is, and any deviations from it will wither away as doomed timelines. But the scratch is part of the alpha timeline. So a question like, when did baby John's meteor land on Earth, has no fundamental true answer. The post-scratch session is in some ways more true, since it overrides the pre-scratch session. But the pre-scratch version of John is necessary, because only he created the 8 human players in the Ecto Lab. The nature of reality in Homestuck is fundamentally contradictory. Lyotard suggests that this may be true of nature in our world, too. The problem is not to learn what the opponent, nature, is, but to identify the game it plays. Einstein balked at the idea that God plays with dice, yet dice is precisely a game for which empirical, sufficient statistical regularities can be established. Once John finds the house juju and initiates the retcon timeline, there isn't even a coherent, stable answer to questions like, does John's arm appear on page 4603? Or, does Terezi kill Vriska? The actual pages of the comic itself are changed. What happens after the coin falls on page 3836 is fundamentally not determined. There are 2 separate links leading to 2 separate outcomes. And how does a reader navigate between those 2 possibilities? By means of Terezi's mind passwords. By means of having specific, locally relevant pieces of information. When the big story starts falling apart, little stories, petit récits, can start to take its place. Instead of one overarching narrative to explain and justify everything, many stories can do the same work in many places on a smaller scale. In science, this is partly seen in the proliferation of subdisciplines, each with their own focus and their own working assumptions, which may not be compatible with other fields. Quantum mechanics and special relativity are completely incompatible, but different kinds of physicists use both of them, for now. In Homestuck, the big story of Homestuck itself starts to erode and fragment apart after Cascade. Caliborn murders the character version of the author, attacks the panels of the actual website, writes into the narrative prompt, sabotages the game cartridge with special stardust that also affects how the website itself displays, and takes over the narration for all of Act 6, Act 6. And it's not just that Hussie's story has been replaced by Caliborn's. The intermissions continuously undermine Caliborn's attempt to establish supremacy over the comic, and John's retcon powers even let him enter and protest Caliborn's rewritten version of Homestuck. Vriska manages to wrench the narration away from Hussie's diversions through sheer force of a personal tantrum. The physical substance, or non-substance, of the farthest ring is literally shattered. The big story is replaced by many little stories, competing and interacting and producing a whole. Jasper's Sprite Squared explains that as a Sprite Squared, they have access to many different timelines and possibilities, perhaps due to having 2 different perspectives on a sprite's inherent secret knowledge of the game and the player's fates. Jasper's Sprite Squared says, but these aren't the only memories of death I have, or the only memories of life I had, for you see I've had many. Squaring these sprites, it's a marvelous thing. It opens you up. The cells become curiously multidimensional, concentrated. I recall the lives of many roses lost, and many Jaspers, maybe even more than 9. Winky cat face. Not that any of them matter now, they each chased their own laser pointers to their respective utilities, and now I am all that's left of them. Mrrr. Each of the different small stories of doomed timelines had their own course and their own ends. But by accumulating multiple small stories, including the very different perspectives of a cat and a human, Jasper's Sprite Squared achieves a self-acceptance, confidence, and contentment that eludes Rose herself. Even the original Alpha timeline, which seems like an obvious grand narrative that loses its hold on the players and must be replaced by a new patchwork timeline, was actually always a product of the individuals who believed in it and acted in certain ways to make it happen. From Becquerel choosing to protect Jade by prototyping himself, to Dave's desire to die heroically, inducing the stable time loop in which Jack shoots him. But the more the grand narrative of the Alpha timeline is fractured, usurped, ignored, contorted, and destroyed, the more free the players become. Ultimately, rather than Hussie's story being replaced by Caliborn's story or John's story, the players escape the comic itself through the doorway juju. Caliborn is trapped in the narrative he tried to take over, and in the meta-narrative that he can force the world to cater to his destructive impulses and his desire for totalizing control. But the surviving kids and trolls escape all of it. They don't finish all their arcs, to some readers' dismay. Terezi still struggles with depression and hopes to reunite with a version of Vriska. They don't complete all the checkboxes for a coming-of-age story. Despite all the parental deaths, Jane's dad comes with them to the new world. The credits show us the kids playing around and acting like kids in ways some of them were never able to do before. Rather than recovering a lost purity or wholeness, rather than restoring the author to his role or putting the careening story back on its rails, Homestuck's happy ending happens because its characters push the destruction of the big story to the breaking point and then right past it. They learn to move forward even with no stable or certain ground, sometimes walking straight out of the panel boundaries to tell and live in their own little stories instead of the sprawling monster they started out in. Describing the postmodern, Lyotard says that it puts forward the unpresentable in presentation itself, that which denies itself the solace of good forms, that which searches for new presentations, not in order to enjoy them, but to present a stronger sense of the unpresentable. The work and text have the characters of an event, understood according to the paradox of the future and past. Let us wage a war on totality. Homestuck not only takes up the challenge of waging such a war, but declares that it can be won. Thanks for joining me. Next week we'll be looking at Linda Hutchin, agency, and complicity.